All right, everyone. Today on, something that should have been common knowledge, but most people don't even know it's a problem. Most Ebola outbreaks, up to half of them, may never have even been quantified since the 1970s. 76, I believe, you get the first sort of big outbreak. Public gets focused on this disease that isn't new, but had never really been documented in large scope before. Ebola gets quantified. Since then, there have been a number of outbreaks of it. Some are small, 10, 20 people die. Some are large, like the West African outbreak several years ago, like the Congo outbreak now that's killed, I think now 1,500 people or something. It's still growing. They're still flaring up all across the Congo. It's made it to Uganda. It may take root there. It turns out a pastor probably spread it to patient zero in Uganda. A pastor from nearby in Congo went across the border, interacted with a child that got infected, and now I believe has died. Unfortunately, it could take root there, which would be a disaster. It's funny because only a week before, Uganda had put out a report saying there was a higher risk of Ebola entering the country than previously thought. And then it's like it enters the country and they're like, whoops, yeah, that was belated. We probably should have told people a month ago to be more careful. It makes sense that most of the outbreaks, probably more than half, wouldn't be quantified because you're thinking about the area in which some of these outbreaks happen. Extremely remote, no real communications uplink to the outside world. You get a situation where you got some village where there's, 100 people, half of them die of Ebola. You may not actually hear of it because that village may not really trade with the surrounding areas more than sporadically. And just because they bring tales of half their village dying to the next village doesn't mean the other village spreads that word to the Western outside world for everyone to sort of document it and know what's going on. There's no guarantee that that happens. Also, you probably have cases where the Ebola kills one or two people, doesn't get found out to be Ebola, they die, and it never spreads further. Because Ebola, under normal circumstances, is not highly infectious. That's why even though it's hit urban areas, its spread is slower than something like influenza. It's not a fully airborne virus. The nightmare scenario, and the thing that I've warned over and over, is it's not the disease now, it's the disease tomorrow that you need to worry about. If it mutates, as the population density of these areas increases, the virus's interaction with humans will increase. At a certain density, it will slowly burn through the population forever if not fully quarantined, which requires military force and extensive outside aid because the African governments are not strong enough and organized enough to pull something like that off. It's not possible. They don't have the medical infrastructure. They don't have the military organizational capacity. The problem is that at some point, inevitably, if it has infected enough people, one of those little viruses that gets replicated will be just right to be fully airborne. And if it hits another person and infects them, and it goes fully airborne from them, pretty soon hundreds of millions, maybe billions of people have died. That's always a possibility. We know that it's capable of significant mutation. In the West Africa outbreak, the reason why it killed several tens of thousands of people instead of just a few thousand is because the first mutation made it more infectious. It became more durable, it became more easy, and I think I had predicted that was probably what happened several months before the World Health Organization announced it, based solely on the virus trajectory. It started burning through people a lot faster. Thankfully, a second mutation started inoculating people, essentially naturally vaccinating them against Ebola by infecting them with an asymptomatic variant. That meant that a lot of people, they became immune, and then of course, people who had already recovered, they've had Ebola, they're not going to get it again. And then the aid workers started using better equipment. I'm sure that helped. The problem is the current outbreak is in a war zone. It's in a civil war zone, and you have a population that's shown an astonishing willingness to attack aid workers, to go and loot Ebola wards, to attack aid vehicles and try to hijack them and stuff for their civil war effort. How do you get a lid on the situation? The military gets involved. They've already been pushed back against. The aid workers wanted more soldiers for defense because they're like, we're getting attacked, people are getting killed. And then in the international community, especially the bigwigs in Europe, were like, oh no, that'll frighten the natives, so to speak. Like, oh, having a bunch of soldiers around will keep people from coming in when they're sick. Well, yeah, it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. But if I'm an aid worker, I'm not even going to be willing to work if you don't supply enough muscle to defend me. If I'm going to sit there risking my life already just by interacting with Ebola patients, I don't also want the possibility of some guerrilla movement coming through the window, looting the ward and shooting me. Or stealing and saying, get out of your suit, we want that too. We'll rinse it off with hot water before we resell it on the black market. We can get $10 for this shit. My goodness. It's a terrible scenario. The more terrible scenario, though, is that it mutates further. And still, doesn't matter how bad it gets, the World Health Organization still not declaring it an international emergency. Still not willing to call it what it is. They don't want to frighten people. What they really don't want to do is admit to the world, hey, Ebola has taken hold in a major metropolitan zone, in a civil war zone with several concurrent outbreaks of other tropical diseases. We don't have a lid on the situation. It's 0% contained, we're getting attacked, and there's not a whole lot we can do. They're afraid that if the world wakes up to the threat that is Ebola, they'll demand a significant international military response. They will demand that the whole area be cordoned off by international forces. That's what they're worried about. They're worried that it'll become a political fiasco, and they're not entirely wrong. So what exactly is going to be done about it? Well, the time to take care of Ebola was yesterday to develop an effective vaccine. They've got an experimental vaccine that shows some promise, but despite the fact that they deployed 100,000 doses in this part of Congo, it still seems to be chewing through people at a fairly rapid pace. And now we're finding out, and this is something you could have inferred anyway, it doesn't take a genius to at least surmise this, that a lot of these outbreaks have never even been quantified, because they take place, again, in a rural area with less communication. But now it's in Butembo. Butembo, where people actually have internet access, and there are paved roads and street lights and things like that. It's not a first world city, but it's got infrastructure. It's got an airport. It's got electricity and plumbing and things like that. It's a nightmare, yeah. It could get a lot worse, though. At any moment, the virus could mutate, go fully airborne, take hold, and then, a month later, 100,000 people are sick all over the world. And it begins spreading like the fucking Black Plague. It is possible for that to happen in an age of international travel and higher population densities. It could go Spanish flu mold. It could become highly infectious. The best case scenario, if it does something like that, is it becomes less deadly. Or there's an asymptomatic variant that starts vaccinating people naturally. Because apparently their experimental vaccine isn't 100% effective. And their serum is basically worthless. The experimental serum that they've been administering lowers the death rate by 10-20%. Well, fuck. Well, okay, my odds of dying of this are a little bit less than 50%. Yay! See, the problem is even if you survive Ebola, it fucks your vascular system and your lymphatic system and gives you PTSD, and all sorts of terrible things happen to you. You'll be sickly most of the time for the rest of your life, it seems. Well, that would suck even worse than I'd rather just fucking die of the Ebola at that point. Just at least we live in a country with the Second Amendment. That makes that easier, I suppose. That's about all. Peace out.